The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Phil DeLuna is currently Director Materials for Clean Fuels at the National Research Council of Canada, where he built and leads a 7-year, $57 million collaborative R&D program focused on developing disruptive technologies to decarbonize Canada. His research on CO2 conversion and accelerated materials discovery has been published in high-impact journals such as Science and Nature and has been cited more than 9,000 times over the past 5 years. He is a Governor General Gold Medalist, a Forbes Top 30 Under 30, a 2-times TEDx speaker, a member of the Royal Society of Canada, an adjunct professor at the Department of Materials Science and Engineering at the University of Toronto, an Action Canada Fellow, and a former federal MP candidate. He has appeared in several documentaries, co-hosts a podcast called What's Next In, and given hundreds of talks on sustainability, innovation, early career development, and diversity in positions of power. Now let's get into the episode with Phil. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Hello, Lysandra. Hey, John.
Love the overlapping every week.
We did an overlap again, John. We got to get this down.
Oh, then people won't think it's live.
Today we're joined by guest Phil DeLuna. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Phil is from the National Research Council of Canada, and we can kind of just dive right in so you can tell us our role there. What's your involvement with clean fuels?
Yeah, so I'm a director at the National Research Council of Canada. The NRC, for those who aren't aware, is the Government of Canada's national lab system. We own and operate 22 national labs across the country, employ over 3,000 scientists, engineers, technicians, researchers, and we work on every problem from quantum mechanics and chemistry and quantum computing to COVID-19 research and vaccine development to digital technologies and preservation of indigenous languages to energy, mining, environment, and clean fuels. So I lead the program called Materials for Clean Fuels. It's a 7-year, $57 million clean tech program focused on 3 thrusts: CO2 conversion, taking captured carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and converting that using renewable electricity into the fuels and chemicals that we need for our quality of life; clean hydrogen production, which is producing a clean burning fuel with as low carbon emission intensity as possible; and artificial intelligence for materials discovery, which is all about using AI and robotics to build what we're calling self-driving labs of the future, essentially a little robotic arm that will make a material, test a material, characterize it, use AI and machine learning to then predict the next material to make, all with very minimal scientific input or scientist input. So that's the work that I do at the NRC. I like to call myself a research capitalist. So similar to how a venture capitalist finds the best startups to invest in and their return on investment is money on a time horizon of 5 years, I scour the world to find the best research to invest and co-develop at NRC National Labs. And my time horizon is 5, 10, 15 years plus, and my return on investment is emission reduction potential. So I would say that's kind of my role and what I do at the NRC. And it's really thinking about how do we decarbonize the hardest to abate sectors, the areas that are really difficult to electrify, and where we really need the fuels and the energy density of fuels to tackle them.
Thank you. I mean, that sounds as if we would say, you've got a bit of a plateful to handle there. You've got quite a few things. Now, what I want to start with a 101 question. We've heard the term clean fuels for a long time, and it's got itself a little bit of a bad reputation, I think, particularly slightly south of your border with, clean coal being talked about, and people go, that's not possible. So could you, for us and our listeners, give us, should we say, a really good working definition of what a clean fuel is, and perhaps give us some examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I tell you what a clean fuel is, I want to describe what I would think a fossil fuel is. To me, fossil fuel is essentially liquefied sunlight, right? It's sunlight that's shone on the earth thousands of years ago, spurred plant matter. That plant matter and that biological matter died, was buried underground. Over thousands of years, it compressed, it liquefied or solidified. That's how you got liquid oil or solid coal. And then us as a species, we dug it up, we extracted its energy through combustion, and then we let that carbon go back into the atmosphere. So in essence, I think of a fuel, whether it's a liquid fuel or a solid fuel, as basically sunlight in a form that we as humans can use. That's the energy that we're extracting from it, is really energy from the sun. So if that's our basic working definition for a fossil fuel, and the reason that's an issue is because when we combust that fossil fuel, we release carbon in the form of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So what is a clean fuel? A clean fuel is a fuel with which we either combust or we use, and either one, it does not emit carbon into the atmosphere, or two, it's net zero, meaning that carbon from the atmosphere is removed in order to create that fuel. So I'll talk about two examples in both of those scenarios. The first is where we don't emit carbon dioxide at all. And an example of a clean fuel is hydrogen. Hydrogen is when it's either combusted or it's used in a fuel cell, the only emission is water. That's the hydrogen cycle. You take water, and in order to produce hydrogen, you can do so renewably through water electrolysis. So you take water and then you pass electricity through it, which splits the water into hydrogen molecules and then oxygen molecules. And then that hydrogen can then be used either combusted or used in a fuel cell. And then that hydrogen then, when it's combusted, turns into water. So there's no carbon in that fuel cycle. It's essentially water, energy, hydrogen, oxygen. Water, energy, hydrogen, oxygen. The big issue with hydrogen is how it's produced today. The majority of hydrogen being produced today is in what's called steam methane reforming, where we take a natural gas or methane and then we combust it, or we heat it up, and we decompose it into, unfortunately, carbon dioxide and then hydrogen. What we can do is we can capture that carbon at its source using carbon capitalization and storage, and then we can bury that underground, and that is what people call blue hydrogen. So hydrogen is in and of itself a clean fuel, and there are different forms that hydrogen can be made, but when it's combusted, there are no carbon emissions. You can either make it through what's called green hydrogen, through water electrolysis and all these sorts of things. And essentially, the main emission from that depends on the grid intensity, or how much carbon intensity is in the electricity that you're using. Or you can make it through natural gas and steam methane reforming, but you have to capture the carbon before it hits the atmosphere, and that's what people call blue hydrogen. There are other forms of hydrogen called turquoise hydrogen, etc. We won't get into that, but it's essentially new technologies that are making hydrogen without a large carbon intensity. So that's an example of a clean fuel that, when combusted, used, burned, doesn't emit CO2 at all. The other side of it is a clean fuel where it's combusted, used, burned, but does emit carbon dioxide. So then you're asking, well, how does that work? How can a fuel that emits carbon dioxide be clean? Well, we have to think about that from the life cycle of that fuel. And I'll take an example of biofuels as an example. A biofuel, let's say ethanol, is essentially you're growing corn, you're growing a plant, and through photosynthesis, that plant matter is capturing carbon dioxide from the air. And then from there, you process that plant matter, like corn, for example, and then you can produce ethanol with it, which can be a drop-in replacement fuel and blended into gasoline, for example. So when you burn that ethanol, the CO2 that goes back into the atmosphere originated from the atmosphere, because it's a closed loop that you're essentially using a plant matter as the transfer. Well, what we got into this mess, right, by taking carbon dioxide out from underground, well, carbon out from underground, and then emitting it into the atmosphere. So it makes sense. The only way we can get out of this mess is to take that carbon dioxide and put it back into the atmosphere. And at the very least, we should not be combusting fuels that come from underground. So a clean fuel is a fuel that's been produced from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. One example of that is biofuels. Another example of that are, you have some new companies like Carbon Engineering or Climeworks or others that are capturing CO2 from the atmosphere directly, not using biological processes, but using engineered processes, and then converting that carbon dioxide into fuel using chemical reactions. And essentially, as long as the energy that's used to upgrade that CO2 into fuel is renewable, you now have a net neutral fuel, or a quote unquote clean fuel. I think at the end of the day, there really is no 100% clean fuel because there is some sort of energy cost there. And currently, unless we're using 100% renewables, hydro, wind, solar, etc., and even then, there's a carbon footprint with the production of those things from the capital expenditure. So there really is no 100% clean fuel unless you want to start talking about fusion or nuclear or these sorts of things, which we do not include in the definition of clean fuels. But it's still better than fossil fuels. And I always tell people when we think about decarbonization and transitioning to a low carbon economy, we cannot let perfect be enemy of the good. And so I always hear people say, we shouldn't do carbon capitalization and storage, or we shouldn't do hydrogen, or we shouldn't do biofuels because it incentivizes the energy ecosystem to continue emitting fossil fuels. And my response to that is always, is it better than what we have now? If it is, we should do it because we don't have time to wait for the perfect solution to come around.
Phil, so you talked about clean fuel. The question for you is there a difference between clean fuel and renewable fuel?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, right? So a renewable fuel is a fuel that is powered by renewable processes. And when I say renewable, that could either be renewable energy processes like solar, wind, hydro, etc., or it can be powered through nature, like biofuels, these sorts of things. And that upgrading of that biofuel, that fermentation or whatever it may be to ethanol or whatever the end fuel also has to be powered by renewable electricity. So that I would call renewable fuels. A clean fuel is a fuel that the emissions are scrubbed from it. And that can either happen pre-combustion or post-combustion through carbon capitalization and storage processes. So I would say a renewable fuel is a fuel that is powered through renewable electricity or renewable power or organic biological processes throughout its life cycle. And a clean fuel is a fuel that gets its carbon emissions scrubbed through carbon capture, utilization, and storage.
Thank you for that. And so now the question, because certainly in Ontario we have a lot of nuclear power. What would nuclear be deemed as in your definition?
In my definition, nuclear it's neither. It's neither a renewable fuel or a clean fuel. It's a nuclear fuel. It's in and of itself. And
Okay.
why we need nuclear is for baseload and baseline, right? So as we all know, the biggest issue with renewables is intermittency. The sun doesn't shine all the time. The wind doesn't blow all the time. What do we do at home at night when we're watching Netflix and the winds are still? And of course, batteries can work on an hour to hour, maybe pushing day to day. But what we really need is that long-term renewable seasonal energy storage, the month to month. How do we harness the renewable power in the summertime to heat our homes in the wintertime, to light our homes in the wintertime? Now, what nuclear does is it provides that baseload. And it allows for that steady, especially in off-peak usage at the nighttime and all these sorts of things that we can use. And it also, if we're using nuclear and we're keeping it at a base load and there's an excess of it, we could use that to produce the renewable fuels or the clean fuels that we were speaking about. We could use that to power the processes to convert the carbon dioxide in the air into fuel that we need, or to convert the plant matter into the ethanol and the biofuels that we need, or to capture the carbon from the atmosphere in the first place. So in my view, nuclear is a critical piece to our energy transition. And it's basically the backbone and the backstop that will allow for the stability and the transformation that is required for the new production of these next generation fuels.
Well, thank you for that, Phil, and I totally agree. And as an ex at the time, Ontario Hydro, certainly nuclear was a big part and is still a big part of the province's requirements. Question for you, because the definition of clean fuel it's maybe not new to you, maybe not new to us, but to our listeners it would be. Is there a premium that these clean fuels have in the marketplace? And if so, is it because it's so new, or is it just because now clients are now starting to understand that they need to do this, and so it's a supply demand issue, and the pricing has increased per se?
I think it's a little bit of both, and it's also complicated with policy measures, right? So in California, you have the clean fuel standard. In Canada, there's a clean fuel standard as well, and that clean fuel standard basically says that as time goes on, a gasoline that's being used for cars has to increase the amount of clean fuel in it. And that clean fuel right now is ethanol, for example. And that ethanol is produced primarily today from plant-based matter, from corn, etc. And so the reason why there is, to answer your initial point, is there a premium to green fuels and clean fuels? Yes, there is a premium to clean fuels. And a lot of that is because the infrastructure, the economies of scale, and the markets for clean fuels haven't been as developed as, let's say, fossil fuels. And so whenever we compare a new generation or a new technology like clean fuels, like renewables, to the incumbent, we oftentimes discount the fact that the incumbent technologies like fossil fuels have had decades worth of subsidies and continuing subsidies, an established and amortized infrastructure of pipelines, of refineries, and all these sorts of things that have been invested upon and will continue and need to show a return because of the financial models that allow them to be produced in the first place. We're talking about large energy infrastructure that had to sign 30-year offtake agreements, and you can't, if you don't fulfill those 30-year offtake agreements, then you're responsible, you're on the hook for that. So when we think about, for example, renewable fuels or clean fuels, that's what you're up against. And the market has not yet advanced enough to price in the infrastructure costs and to really build out that infrastructure costs to meet the demand. As we start to see more of these clean fuel standards come into place, as we start to see more and more automotive companies and cars develop their engines in order to be able to run on 100% clean fuels, and as we continue to start to see more pushes for decarbonization, especially when it comes to grids, and we're talking about clean fuels from the perspective of gasoline, but there's also renewable natural gas, which is in and of itself a clean fuel that we need to heat our homes. As we start to see more and more of this happen, you will start to see the price of clean fuels decrease. And that's the case for every technology, that cost abatement curve, that technology learning curve. That's just the way that these things scale.
You raise a really good point, because when the Green Energy Act was introduced in Ontario, solar generation was quite expensive, and now we're finding solar generation is actually replacing in Alberta some of the cheaper option and an alternative to even natural gas that's actually in the province. So I know as it scales, things get cheaper, and it does follow a pattern. Same with battery and battery storage. The price of batteries have dropped significantly. So people just need to be aware that will occur as the market matures. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I think we all know on this podcast, and most of our listeners do, that there's this target of achieving net zero by 2050. And so my question is a really simple one, but your answer might be a little more complicated. How important are clean fuels to achieving that net zero, and what needs to happen for that contribution to have an impact?
That's a really great question. So if we break down the world's emissions now, about 27%, almost a third of it, is electricity production. About 25 to 30% is in transportation. Then it starts decreasing from there. Buildings and lived environments, agriculture, land use change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if we think about clean fuels, it's really about addressing the emissions that we need for transportation. And when I say transportation, I don't just mean moving people, but more importantly, moving goods and moving things. If we think about lightweight mobility transportation, of course, electric vehicles are going to, and I think, explode and corner the market there. But then what do we do about freight and flight? And unfortunately, like battery densities and the weight of batteries just make it impractical in order to fly large passenger airplanes. Hydrogen is being looked at as an alternative for this, but most likely that's only going to make sense in short regional flights because of, again, the energy density and storage capacities. As you increase the amount of hydrogen that you need thicker and thicker walls on your storage vessels, and in order to pressurize them, in order to keep them safe, especially for flight. So there's going to be a limit to that, but to weight. So when it comes to sustainable aviation fuels and biofuels, we're really going to need clean fuels to address that market. And the same thing I think we'll see with freight and shipping, especially as we continue to see, an increase in globalization and trade among developing economies. To get to net zero, it's I want to stress that it's not a sort of one approach or one technology that's going to save us. And everyone always says it's not a silver bullet, it's a silver buckshot. We've heard this a million times, and it's so true. If in 2020, the International Energy Agency did a report. It's called the Technology Perspectives Report. I analyzed over 800 technology pathways to get to net zero by 2050. And they found that it's almost an equal contribution and combination of fuel switching, of biofuels, of renewables, of carbon capitalization and storage, of hydrogen, of energy efficiency. And what matters isn't necessarily one specific technology over the other, but what jurisdiction you're in, and how does that jurisdiction and the local resources of that jurisdiction lend to the solution that you need. I'll give you a very simple example. A clean hydrogen. That's going to look very different in Canada based on province. In Quebec, where you have an abundance of hydroelectricity, and this is already happening, you're seeing lots of companies build electrolysis plants. You're using that electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen and use that hydrogen. But in Alberta, which has a ton of natural gas and the fossil fuel infrastructure and pipelines like the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line and lots of storage capacity, it makes a lot more sense to use the natural gas and then split it either using steam methane reforming or methane pyrolysis, and then capture the carbon dioxide and then store it. So at the end of the day, you have two jurisdictions where you're still producing clean hydrogen, low carbon emission hydrogen, but they're going about it in very different ways. And that's just in Canada, that's just one technology, that's just two provinces. Now imagine that for all of the different technology pathways around the world, right? If we're thinking about how people are going to do waste to natural gas storage in energy dense and metropolitan cities versus how you're going to do that in the prairies, that's a whole other conversation. So clean fuels will be a critical piece, and I think it'll account for about 20% of the energy or emissions reduction potential costs in the future. But what's important to realize is that might be 80% in one jurisdiction, it might be 5% in another. It's not a clear cut across regions. And that's the resolution that we need to think about in this energy transition, is what is the best solution that makes sense for you and where you are.
Thank you for that. I mean, that's a nice piece of looking to the future. And I'm going to balance that off with looking at the here and now. And at the time of recording this podcast, we're seeing a number of countries are putting in embargoes on the importation of Russian oil and gas. I think the US immediate. Here in the UK, well, we're going to take a little bit of time and think about it. Germany, well, they can't do it immediately. What do you think? I mean, I don't want us to speculate on where this is going to go, but given that this is yet another one of these oil and gas shocks that we have from time to time because of geopolitics, what sort of impact do you think this may have on the clean fuel sector?
Yes, absolutely. And before I answer this question, I want to preface this by saying this is a terrible and horrific and very serious situation. And my heart, my thoughts, my prayers, my everything goes out to the people of Ukraine. I don't know about you, but for the past 2 weeks, I haven't been able to sleep. I've been on my phone, doom scrolling, looking at the news, and it's awful. It's absolutely awful. And I cannot believe that in this day and age, something like this is happening. It's unconscionable. That being said, we have to recognize, right, the world is interconnected. The world economies are interconnected. The world energy system is interconnected. And something so horrific and mindless and pointless and terrible has reverberation and consequences around the world, and especially when it comes to the energy industry. So let's approach this from a couple of perspectives. The first is, in my view, is the immediate term, which is the shock that we're seeing to the oil and gas prices and how that's impacting people on their day to day. We're seeing record prices, and a lot of people will say, well, that just goes to show that we need to increase Canadian oil and gas production, all this stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, to an extent, but the issue is that we don't have the refining capacity here. And what is actually the limitation is we can ship our crude, we can ship to the full capacity that we possibly can, maybe to the Asian markets, maybe to our European neighbors, but more specifically about, the majority of our export in oil and gas goes down south to the United States. But even there, the limit then becomes how quickly can they refine that, and how can they transport that to the pump. And so I do not think, unfortunately, even if we were to turn the taps on to the full amount that we possibly can, we're not going to see gas prices decrease anytime soon sharply, unless we start looking into strategic oil reserves, or we start going into, I know that America, for example, is having conversations with them and trying to see if they can work on increasing capacity there, which again, it's the devil. It's the sort of the least worst of the options that you have, and that's kind of the situation, the reality that we are in terms of geopolitics. So that's in terms of the immediate short-term shock, and I think to me the hardest part is, and what I always try to keep in mind, are the people who can't afford the oil and gas prices to increase in our societies. The blue collar workers that my parents are these folks. My dad grew up in Windsor. My dad worked in the auto sector. He worked at Ford, and then he was laid off in the 2008 financial crisis when the auto sector collapsed. He needs to drive to work in these sort of small to medium-sized cities. There isn't the public infrastructure that I'm blessed to have here in Toronto. And so these are the people who are feeling, in addition to inflation at the grocery store, inflation in the housing market, and it's a very serious issue. So I'm more concerned about how do we alleviate the pressure for the working class in this country, especially when it comes to at the pump. Now, in the long term, again, what I think this is going to do is accelerate the need for the transition, right? I mean, we've already been talking about climate change and net zero, and people are saying, yes, we have to get to it, but it's 30 years away, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now we see that, yes, it's 30 years away, but also energy independence is a national security issue. And people have said this. This has been a key argument for the energy transition for decades. But people don't feel it unless they're in times of conflict, right? And I think there's an issue there. I always like the energy transition to sort of, you have global warming and you have a global pandemic, and they're very similar, right? They both have lagging indicators. Deaths are a lagging indicator of infection. Average temperature rise is a lagging indicator of CO2 emissions. The only difference is the time frame. Whereas in COVID-19, it's a time frame of weeks. Climate change is a time frame for years. What this geopolitical conflict is doing, is increasing the urgency of that time frame and creating the pressures not in the matter of years, but in the matter of months, in the matter of now. And if there's one silver lining, if you can call it that, through all of this terrible and tragic loss of life, it's that the West, on a geopolitical side of things, have really united across to support democracy in order to support Ukraine, and at the same time has united in its renewed recognition that the energy transition is not only good for the environment and good for our economies and good for our people, but it's also imperative for our national security. So I think going forward, those conversations are going to be more and more at hand. And if you think of the autocratic dictatorships, and if you think of the least democratic countries in the world, there's a stark overlap between them and fossil fuel resources. So if we can wean ourselves off of these fossil fuel resources, we can be less dependent on those economies in those countries, and we can empower democratic societies at the same time as saving our planet. It's a win-win-win-win-win-win-win. And so I'm hopeful that this is just yet another reason that we're going to see that critical mass shift.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think, just to endorse what you were saying at the beginning of your thing, I regard myself as a European, even though the UK has left the EU. I still carry a passport that says EU, even though it's not recognised as one. And in fact, I'm qualified as a European engineer. I never thought in my lifetime that I would see armed conflict in Europe of the scale and nature. As a younger person, I grew up during the Cold War, and the big red menace and everything else. I thought we'd moved on from that. In the mid-90s, I did work in the former Soviet Union as part of a technical assistance package, and you thought to yourself, these are permanent changes that are going to be for the greater good. And it's clearly not. And I think all of us on this podcast would say, this is just a deplorable situation. And as you say, our thoughts, prayers, and whatever we've got are with the people who are being impacted by this. And I think your point is very well made. Overall, it's not just going to be people in Ukraine who are going to be impacted by this. There's going to be, a lot of people impacted in different ways. And I was really interested that you touched on the fuel poverty, but it's something we've talked about before in our podcasts. And it's something in this country, at one point, we had this thing that, the sort of triumvirate we want with fuels. We want them secure, we want them clean, and we want them cheap. Easy.
Yeah, and if I could just add to what you're saying, John, like in North America, specifically Canada, we've had this cheap surplus access to energy, and I think this is the first time in my lifetime. I know in the 70s there was concern and things had happened there, but like you, I didn't think anything like this would happen, and now the world, certainly Canadians and North Americans, have woken up that things have to change at the very least to help support people like the Ukrainians. So I think this is great motivation for us to get on with it and start doing things that need to get done with.
Yeah, absolutely. If I just may add one more thing. For your listeners out there who are Canadian, the Canadian government is matching donations to the Canadian Red Cross for humanitarian relief efforts to Ukraine. So if you're able and you have some money to spare, especially I know in these trying times with inflation, I encourage you to donate. I have, and I think it's really important that we try to help any way we can. It's so heartbreaking to see this happening, and I'm at a loss for words of how one man can cause so much misery.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask Lysandra if we could put a link when we release this.
Yep.
I was going to say, I'm going to just touch on that because I'm really intrigued to hear what you're saying about supporting the Red Cross. We have a thing here called Disasters Emergency Committee that's a grouping of 15 charities, and the government has done some doubling on that. But outside of the work that I do, I'm an active Rotarian, and our Rotary Club, we've got a campaign going at the moment, and we are raising money for Red Cross because we've thought about what is the best way to immediately provide some support to what's going on. And the truth of it is, Red Cross are probably the most skillful organisation for working in conflict zones. And getting right in there. So it's brilliant that, as you say, there is some coming together, and hopefully we can get something positive out of that.
Well, this has been an informative episode, Phil. Thanks for coming on. To end off this episode, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Oh, that's a good question. We kind of dived into geopolitics and some really heavy stuff at the end there, but
Yeah.
I think if we were to sum up this episode, and what I would say is clean fuels are an integral and super important part of this energy transition, that the definition of clean fuels are always evolving, and that there are many ways to produce a clean fuel or renewable fuel or what have you. And at the end of the day, regardless of title, on whatever you call your fuel or your energy source, look at what is the carbon intensity and look at the life cycle of that carbon intensity. From the moment that fuel is either produced or made or sourced to the moment it's combusted, what are the emissions associated with that life cycle and that supply chain, and make a decision on what can lower the emissions of your current process. And then again, I'll iterate this as my last point. We cannot let perfect be enemy of the good. So make changes, and every incremental change helps because it creates a baseline with which you can work for and improve some more.
Great point to end off on. Dave, John, any final comments?
Yeah, I think what Phil was saying, and it's been suggested by a variety of guests we've had here, is that there isn't a perfect one solution, and it is a transition. It's not, there's no black and white answers on this, but there has to be action, and it has to be looking at multiple things, and clean energy is one of those things. And I think the idea of what Phil described and explain the definition of that, I think will be really helpful to our listeners as they start approaching the marketplace differently.
And I follow on, Dave, from what you're saying. We've said a number of times in our podcast that we are enemies of the binary solutions. This is good, that is bad, whatever. But the one piece I'm taking away and I'm going to be using is silver buckshot. I like that.
Dave, John, Phil, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
It's been
Thanks
great.
very much.
Informative. Thank you. Thanks, Phil.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn post. See you next week.